Welcome everyone to Aging Fire Training Officers Uncensored. It's Matt and Andy, and we're super happy to do this second episode. The first episode was really well received, and folks from all over in the fire service have given us a tremendous amount of validation and feedback. We did observe after that initial episode, we have a little editing to do based on some of the content that in our uncensoredness we might have disclosed a little prematurely, but we're going to fix that. It's very little editing. And then that initial episode with the focus being on Matt will be available again. And today we're going to switch roles and responsibilities, and I'm going to turn it over to my brother, Matt Van Giesen. Matt, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's great to be here again. And yeah, to everybody that watched and gave that thumbs up, I appreciate it. And apologies for having to drop down that other episode. We'll get that back up as soon as we yeah, a little bit of diarrhea of the mouth, maybe. I don't know.
We have that proclivity in the fire service in general, you know.
Yeah. And it's a no harm, no foul, but we don't want anything to go where it shouldn't. And you know, and on that note, real quick, the organization that I'm working with currently that we talk a lot about, you know, no fault on them. You know, I don't want it to come across that episode was I'm here to save their day and fix them because they're so effed up, because it's anything from the truth. They are so in front and on top of what they've got that they're proactively going outside the box to try a new method of making themselves better. But anyhow, let's yeah, today I want, because the biggest question I got asked after some of my associates viewed that was hey, who's Andy? Where's this guy from? So and I think a great one, I see you've taken a card out of my deck and your background. Let's talk about that. That's a great place to start. Just
Yeah, and I have to admit, Matt, that that's exactly what I did. I said, what a great idea Matt had. Let me do that. So, oh, there goes my Chihuahua. So this was a call actually where I had to go over the edge of a bluff and rescue a dog that was in a very precarious spot on some outgrowth over the edge of the bluff. And if the dog moved, the dog was going to fall to its death. And like you said in the green room, better than it could be said anywhere else, if you don't rescue the dog, you're rescuing the owner just a couple of hours later.
Yeah.
So, you know, we got a call, and one of the disciplines in the fire service that I love and went to a lot of training for with the great Doug Clark out in Eastern Washington many times and spent many hours with him, is rope rescue. So we were actually just setting up our rigging to send me over the edge with a harness for a human that I was going to try to figure out once down there to get on this animal. And that's exactly what happened, among some other things. But that's what I was doing here. I was selecting what I was going to throw on my rack before going over the edge.
Yeah, and we did similar calls. People not familiar with the geography, topography of the Northwest, a lot of the islands have 100-foot bluffs, sand, clay, gravel bluffs that drop off down towards usually beach, rocky beach and water, with limited access. And yeah, these are pretty common calls. And I always like, with a dog, you could lower the tempo. The risk was less. And they essentially were a training. But like you said, if we didn't get to the dog, the homeowner would with garden hoses, electrical cords, and whatever they could find.
Yeah, I would. I mean, if it were my dog, you know. So, you know, we felt like we were really doing the right thing. And you know, your appraisal of that is precisely right. There, you know, it's clearly emotionally arousing because it's a living thing, but it isn't a human, it isn't a kid, it isn't an adult. And um, rope rescue is one of those disciplines where, um, the old saying, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So
Oh,
to have
absolutely.
the discretionary time to think through the rigging, think through the vectors, think through the directionals, think through, are we, doing a real wrap three, pull two? Are we, properly setting the belay line? Are we doing the things that we were trained to do without the extraordinary pressure of,
A human limit.
non-discretionary time where there's a human's life in the balance?
Right, right. So, can you tell me a little more? What was your role on the department as a whole, but specifically maybe with the rope rescue and the
So
technical rescue stuff?
that's a good question. Um, volunteer department programs, very often are the cultures of them are expressions of the resources, the leadership, the budget, and you know, large professional agencies have robust programs in addition to fire suppression and EMS. They'll have robust vehicle extrication, robust rope rescue. Rope rescue programming in my agency was me essentially as the subject matter expert conducting trainings with some degree of frequency in some of the most fundamental kinds of applications of the equipment we had. And we did not have uh, a $5,000 Vortex artificial high directional like we would use in training. We had a couple of class 3 harnesses, some edge guards, some 11 millimeter rope, uh, and a bunch of carabiners and a bunch of pulleys. And you had to really employ rigging knowledge to make that work,
Sure.
whereas we had less benefit on the equipment. So my role was on those kinds of events, um, safety, of course, because the safety officer themselves, unless you know what a Bolin with a Yosemite finish is, unless you know what the angle limitations are in setting up rigging, you really can't do the safety job for the rigging.
Sure.
So I
You
was
don't know what you're checking. Yeah.
exactly. So I would function essentially as the rigging safety officer. And then, uh, uh, depending upon in a volunteer agency, someone's um, comfort level with this particular discipline, and again, in the volunteer fire service, you know who's on the team, but you don't always know who's on the call. So you
Right.
got to Vince Lombardi that situation. You got to work with what you got. So if it became I have to check the rigging and then I'm the person who's going over the edge and then letting everybody know before I leave, this is what you have to do because when I'm
Right.
down there, I'm not going to be able to coach you. All of that briefing had to occur before I went over the edge.
Well, and I think it really it illustrates and epitomizes the volunteer fire service then and even today, where we make the best of what we have, and it's rarely an ideal situation from equipment, staffing, and even just who, like you said, who shows up, especially in these smaller rural type departments.
Oh yeah, dude. I mean, 100%. Those kinds of calls absolutely press the limits of any small volunteer agency, whether their budget is $600,000 or $300,000 annually, or maybe even up to $1 million. That's still a small agency. And um, when in our state, Matt, as we met in a class. People from every agency come together.
Yeah.
Big city, big county, law enforcement with a public safety apparatus and fire or technical rescue. And you see such a wide variety of resource allocation or professional development in the people of those agencies. And the thing that brings us all together, I think, uh, is a desire to serve and to be of value in our respective communities. And the kind of cool thing about our domain in fire, as opposed to, because I'm exposed a lot with what I do to public safety and the law enforcement context, and even some of the specialties in there, crisis negotiation,
Right.
hostage negotiation, etc. Um, while every one of these domains has some braggadocio and chest puffing, I do think the guardian and protection spirits of the fire service reduce somewhat the competitiveness that we can see in some of the other public safety domains.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Especially, maybe not in the firehouse between calls,
right.
but certainly on calls.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of equity. There's a lot of equity on calls in the fire service because the stakes are so high that everybody seems to be looking downfield at the goalpost the same way. There isn't a lot of room for um opinion that isn't deliberately focused on the most important thing, which is saving someone's life. You know, like the three tactical priorities of of the incident command system: life safety, incident stabilization, property conservation, in that order.
Right.
And when it's life safety, man, everybody seems to be on the same page.
Yeah, I always noticed the same. The more intense, the more high risk the call was, the more focused the team seemed to be. And we always noticed, when you go a period without calls, and it seems, I don't know, maybe career has the same, but it always seemed to be magnified in the volunteer, the drama, the interpersonal drama, that always seemed to increase. But when you had a few calls back to back, and especially high stake calls, boy, the team came right back together. The family was one unit again, and
Yeah.
it
And
was kind of a neat phenomena to see.
that's a beautiful insight because the drama that can occur in a volunteer agency is no different than what can happen in a career agency. And um, we
Well,
have the
maybe
same.
more.
Oh, you know what? I would actually contend that I wasn't going to say that, but
I'll say it.
yeah, I would agree with you, and I think to some extent it's because smaller volunteer agencies have less regulatory and community oversight than big city agencies
Sure.
where there's nexus to a lot of bureaucracy. You know, I think you said it best last week, Matt, when um you were talking about small volunteer agencies in many cases are aware. If you want to find an agency that really has a low bar of expectation by the community that
Mhm.
funds it, call your local volunteer fire department, because the standard that the community has is that they showed up,
Right.
and they have no real context to appraise performance.
Well, even time, that acceptance of, yeah, my husband's having a heart attack, but it took them 8 minutes to get here. Well, that's just because I live out in the middle of nowhere.
Right. Right.
That acceptance isn't there when you live in an urban environment. But and I think that would be a great place to go in another episode, is that comparison, sizing of departments, career staffing versus volunteer staffing, because they're each bring their own unique challenges. But
I agree.
so where are you today? How did you get into the fire service? Let's just start that. Where did you get your bug? Where did you catch it?
I'm a late bloomer, brother, in everything. Just in everything, I'm a late bloomer. So, you know, if our listeners, viewers haven't figured it out yet, I'm not from around here. You know,
I
I didn't. I'm
didn't
from the
know if
New
we
York.
should tell them that we're both transplants from the East Coast.
I moved out to the Pacific Northwest in 2003 and just haven't looked back. And um, I came out here as a business owner. I was doing some contract work for the Department of Defense, and I needed to be close to JBLM, which at the time was just simply Fort Lewis. Um, and that had pretty much run its course by 2007. And um, or I had run its course. I had been put in touch with the limits of my entrepreneurship at the time, um, and needed to go back to work. So I went back to work in psychiatric care and services in our state, that domain of operations, because that was my education and context before I even started my own enterprise. I was working in care and services as a case manager in a really urban environment in New Jersey, in the New York metropolitan area, and that's where I'm from. Um, and when when working in an environment where I could be presented with um, anger, aggression, and violence within the people served,
Hmm.
um, I had some natural capacity to manage that well, but I became fascinated with an exploration into understanding my own fear and wanting to get past that. And that for me is what really led me into the fire service. My time as a man to have enlisted in the services, for example, you're a veteran of our United States Navy.
Hmm.
I I never served in the armed services, and I always regretted that. And I have my reasons for that, that as our
Sure.
episodes wear on, um, is something that I've always had to kind of live with. I wish I could have done that. But the closest thing that I could do to understanding and challenging my limits on what was scary, and to augment my identity as a person who wanted to live out these principles of service and duty, and
Hmm.
to some extent maybe a little heroism. The fire service became fundamentally clear as the place to go, and I had an opportunity to serve in my volunteer agency and signed up, and that wasn't until, how old was I when that happened? Um, my early 40s.
Okay.
Um, so
I don't think that's an uncommon occurrence. I see, I mean, locally here in over the 15, 17 years that I was involved, um, a regular occurrence to see um, a small sampling of people over 40 coming into the fire service, and for various reasons, but I think they all kind of circle around um, that identity thing. Like you said, kind of a late bloomer, and we don't need to get into the psychology of that necessarily, because that could be 3 or 4 episodes.
yeah, I think we should at some point, but
I know, and I'm sure we will. Yeah,
yeah,
but it's that realization that they, whether it's proving to themselves or just being part of that team because they're finally comfortable with themselves, or getting to a point where they need to challenge themselves to solidify that identity that they've accepted.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I was in a period of kind of establishing my identity, I think. Um, I
Hmm.
had, because of my business, I had a tremendous and wonderful opportunity and experience to support the men and women in our special operations community,
Hmm.
doing very high risk things and really being struck by the degrees of selflessness and technical competence and duty and honor and loyalty to one another, that I longed to have something like that, which I could not really capture as as a contractor supporting those kinds of initiatives. I loved the work I was doing, don't get me wrong, but I
Sure.
wanted more, and I wanted to feel like
maybe
what it would.
maybe maybe to be part of it instead of an outside supporting
Yeah,
observer, really, because you were more in an observer role, supporting role, but to actually be part of maybe a team.
yeah, and that did
Well,
it for me. That that
yeah,
that
well, and
that
let's, when you look around options, I mean, relatively speaking, volunteer fire service is probably the easiest thing to get into.
Well, and in a small volunteer agency, the barrier is absolutely very
Minimal.
low.
Yeah.
You
Next to
know,
nothing.
yeah, I mean, you can make of it what you want. And I took, and still do to a large extent, I took my physical fitness seriously. I wanted to be able to meet all the standards that
Sure.
anyone else would have to meet. And I'll say in a quick overview, you know, I pursued and acquired all of the relevant certifications that anyone else would have in a career agency. Fire one, fire two, hazmat ops, hazmat operations, hazmat awareness, instructor one.
But you did finally pass.
Yeah, I did. You know, that's where, you know, for our audience, that's where you and I met, you know, like I had
It was
taken that damn IFSTA test.
it was a challenging experience. Let's
And,
just say there were some hurdles that
yeah,
were in
and
place.
let's not get into trouble again like we did last week, because
Right.
if I go down the whole of the approach to human learning and measurement that was expressed by that agency test, I could get into trouble. So suffice it to say, I eventually passed the damn test by studying the test bank of questions and then answering the appropriate number to the value that was necessary. But I found
Let's just say standardized testing is a lackluster at best.
I took that test as a fairly well-read, you know, post-college graduate student, and I couldn't pass the thing 4 times. I passed it on the 5th on a dispensation from, we're going down the hole. I passed it. I passed it. I had to call.
People get used to it. This will happen regularly.
I had to call um the who proctors it, the fire marshal's office,
Yeah.
I had
Yep.
to call them and say, hey, look, you know, I've taken this thing 4 times, I have failed it 4 times, I need to take it, I have to get this. And I had to get permission to, because I think you could only test 4 times in 1 year. And I'm like,
Yeah, there's a limit, how many days between tests, there's a criteria.
and I said, I'm not waiting. And I'm begging you, please give me permission to do this. And they did. And they let me.
Yeah, they were, I will say that they were great people down at the, I haven't worked with them in a long time. That's the state patrol runs the fire marshal.
That's it. That's the word I was looking for. The state patrol, which is the state fire marshal's office. And
Right.
they're
Yeah. They were great. Always great people to work with. I won't mention any names, but
yeah,
I had some dealings with them later on. Actually, my instructor 2 course ended up down there as a template of what they would like to see. So
yeah, that's pretty cool, Matt.
it was pretty, yeah, it was a year, almost a year to the date from when I started the course to when I actually submitted and completed my my portfolio. So
Yeah, man.
anyhow, so yeah, so we know why you joined, and so what would you remember about when that was? Not that I'm trying to date you by reverse
No,
math,
I think
because
it
I'm
was
not that
11 or
smart.
12 years ago at
Okay,
this point.
so you had a decade, a good decade in the fire service.
Over, yeah, well over. I think it was well over. It was over 11, and I don't think I reached 12. And I had my fill of the things that get in the way of the purity of the fire service, particularly
Yeah.
agency culture and the way leadership can influence agency culture. And
And I think we touched on it last at the last episode with the political nature of how they set up fire protection districts in the state of Washington.
it's amazing to me. I had occasion recently to engage the state auditor's office about some stuff, let's just say. And I am completely struck by regulatory agencies like them, the only one that has a nexus to the volunteer agency, with no enforcement teeth. There is no enforcement, barring litigation that I'm aware of practice standards in the volunteer agencies. They empower the local communities to select local leadership to manage it.
Right.
And all I can say is that, I'm deeply involved in psychiatric care and services and healthcare with a nexus to the Centers for Medicaid, Medicare, the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Hospital Organizations, the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, places that have tremendous influence over the expression of practice. You would think with the life and death stakes we have in the fire service, and in particular in the volunteer fire service,
Right.
you would think we would have a tremendous amount of oversight driving practice standards. And I cannot believe that we don't.
Nothing.
It's astonishing to me. This is no different than, believe it or not, in prisons and in jails, practice standards around the use of segregation or restraint, for example, or if human rights violations are occurring, how that's regulated.
Right.
Minimal to negligible oversight in those domains. It's
Wow.
amazing. It's amazing to me, bro. Astonishing.
So that kind of it glazes over, but so where are you today in the fire service?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you skirt around it there.
So where I am today is wishing I were back.
Mhm.
On one hand, not able to give it what I would want to give it because what I do professionally now as an educator um, and thought leader in a particular space, stakeholder, what
Mhm.
I do is explosively growing, and I feel very blessed by that. And wanting to go back and serve in a different capacity to help make improvements on the kinds of things we're talking about. That's where I am at the fire service today. I left volunteer operations in May of this year.
Mhm.
And there were some things going on. I was contemplating a serious move to Wyoming. Um, there was need for that. I had been a manager in our state's care and services system for much longer than I've been in the fire service.
Right.
And for me, that had run its course by October of last year, where my wife and I decided that we had been developing a training practice for many, many years in verbal de-escalation, crisis intervention for all of the disciplines, public safety, behavioral
Right.
health, private enterprise. And it became time, and that's this organization, Jumpstart Mastery. It became time to make the jump.
Right.
And I had done a lot of work with EMS in general, providing de-escalation training to the organizations that administer that training to all of our agencies throughout the state that, either pursue OTEP online or needed support in the relevant chapters of behavioral emergencies. They would call
Right.
me, and that's easy for me to do. So where I am today is romanticizing to some extent, which is impossible to not do as a firefighter.
Yeah, it never leaves you. Never
Yep.
leaves.
Wishing I was back involved, realizing that there are tangible reasons I'm not involved at this time. And then there are personal issues that I have to work through as I get older. I think you even mentioned this last week, Matt. Um, I have found myself less tolerant and more willing to speak out against complete nonsense.
Sure.
And leadership in our agency very often is filled with poor ego functioning, people who do not receive feedback well.
Yeah.
And they
I
don't
think
like it.
I'm pretty sure there's a requirement to be on a board that you have to be a narcissist.
Dude, it's everywhere.
It's my experience.
It's everywhere. And if someone is assertive and competent in their expertise and in their languaging to feedback, messaging that speaks to the need for improvement about certain things, leaders can feel very threatened by that.
That's an instant threat, and yeah. Yep.
And it's a shame. It's a terrible, terrible shame that our culture in the fire service, which is so desperately in need of a fundamental overhaul on the principles that we know work in interpersonal communication, in engendering relationship, in making effective teams. Kind of amazing that that the vertical movement to leadership, it very often, from what I've seen, those things that we cherish and consider a priority seem to become less important up the ladder.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're here, Andy. We're gonna do our part to fix that.
And that's what I love about you and me and this little thing that we're doing, because it's our way of doing that now without being in the crosshairs of a commissioner or a chief, while in the agency, to manage the image projection of what the frustration with that can do within a community, or what it can do within the firefighter who's making these observations and feeling very frustrated. And if they draw attention to themselves in that way, they start to get culled out of the herd, so to speak.
I look at it this way: the organizations that we were with kind of deplatformed us, so we've created our own platform.
Yeah, I'd say that's a great way of articulating that. I would agree. And to the extent that we can raise awareness and consciousness even within leaders, because I don't think we're not anti leadership. We're anti bad leadership.
Yeah. We're definitely not anti-leadership. I think we're just, and we'll get into all those. What make good leaders?
Yeah,
and how to deal with the bad leaders.
And there's some wonderful leaders in our discipline, in our domain. There are absolutely
sleepers. A lot of them are sleepers. They
Yeah.
don't want to step up. They don't want to take on those positions. They don't want to be a part of it because they saw what has happened to people like us.
Yeah, I would agree. And I have to say that there is some relief from being out from underneath that nonsense, that political nonsense.
It feels good. Give it 6 months and you'll really, after the 6-month point, you start to really relax. And then you're not, well, I guess it's more like you let your guard down. You could actually, you don't feel like you're not a target.
Yep.
And then after a year of being away, then you can actually start listening to the scanner and start talking about calls. And for the first year, I didn't even want to hear the word fire department. I don't even like to hear the sirens.
Yeah.
Going off.
We've talked about that. You lived through a lot with that. In my case, Matt, it was the thing that I was happy to get away from was what we refer to in workplace culture as the chilled environment. What began to happen with me was a chill. And that is that.
I went through the deep freeze. I was in the deep freeze and I still stayed, but
and there's nothing more insensitive to a human being than that. If you can defend your argument, if you don't like what a person in an agency, even within the leadership structure, is saying or doing, not communicating with them, that transcends appropriateness and goes into inappropriateness. Defend your argument, make your point about what you don't like about me, and let's settle it. But instead, what we have is this withdrawal to chill, which is convenient for them very often because they don't have the skills to mediate or navigate the conflict, and resolution needs to occur. And when you see that, it becomes so discouraging because now you're dealing with someone in leadership who doesn't have the absolutely the required skills to be in that chair,
Right, right.
to navigate
We
conflict with people in your group.
Right. Yeah, we saw a lot of the narcissistic, the yo-yo,
Oh,
bring you in with compliments and, oh, good job, you did it. That was awesome. That was awesome. And then as you walk out, the knives hit you in the back.
it's
It's
awful.
just it's a constant yo-yo back and forth, undermining you on one side, and then on the other side, glad handing you.
It's
So,
so fundamentally dishonest. It's so
well, and
there's
it's an
not a
illness. It's a
dude, it
sociopath.
is, and there's nothing constructive that comes from it. Nothing.
So this is a
Only
good
destructive.
right. So this is a good lead into what you're doing today, which is this is awesome. And then I'll finish up with how I connected with you on that level. But
Yeah.
um, so Andy got me into this really cool thing he's doing, and it's called Jumpstart Mastery. And I originally was kind of like, I'm not sure how I relate with this stuff, because that's what it is to me. It's stuff because it's so big. It's literally global, and it's growing. It's going to be interstellar pretty soon at the rate it's going. So why don't you tell us what Jumpstart Mastery is, and how it pertains to those of us in, not just because our community isn't just volunteer firefighters, it's firefighters, it's EMS, it's dispatchers, and I even have a couple of guys that couldn't hack it in the fire service and they had to become cops. So I even have a couple of law enforcement buddies. It's all right. The fire service isn't for everyone.
Yeah.
It's
You,
like,
I,
not the
I,
Navy wasn't for everybody. Some people had to go in the Air Force, so it's okay.
I spend a lot of time at our Criminal Justice Training Commission in Burien,
Hmm.
as a stakeholder and a thought leader in a particular training domain, crisis
Sure.
de-escalation. And the commander there always referred, he and I would laugh all the time, that the terminology that the law enforcement community refers to us as is the red menace when
Yes.
we, when we show up. So, when I hear that people left the fire service because they couldn't hack it and become a police officer, it's part of that ongoing like Army Navy football
Oh,
game kind of
always.
thing. I
Yeah,
love it,
always. Always.
So, in what I do, Matt, the fire service in my heart is inextricably linked to the worldview that I have of anger and how to diffuse it and how to extinguish it. And the fire service has thoroughly informed a method that we utilize in crisis de-escalation, doing things in an organized way, following sequential procedures, and helping someone regain control of themselves in the interest of life safety, incident stabilization, property conservation, right?
Right.
So, I actually have used the fire cycle to describe a cycle of aggression or cycle of anger. It's
Hmm.
it's neurologically very similar.
Yeah.
There's a chemical reaction between a number of forces that sustains, culminates to its fullest potential based on these variables, and then moves into decay, just like a fire. So, what I do today is bring people together from the public safety domain, and in the fire service now, particularly on the West Coast, you're seeing a massive initiative toward moving fire into the co-responder model of mental health crisis intervention. You're seeing a movement from the public safety agencies and law enforcement now shifting some of these responsibilities to the fire community. And there's some very exciting programs happening in our state where fire EMS is getting involved with behavioral health and responding to calls for mental health crisis within the
Mhm.
populations living with houselessness and homelessness, substance use disorder, the human trafficking environment. Fire is getting more involved. We have a lot of hats, as you know, that we wear.
Do you think that's because law enforcement is maybe understaffed, overtasked? or just not fitting in their wheelhouse as well because of their,
I, yeah.
um,
Well,
and we're just, I mean, I think we're well equipped for it because, um, well, it fits our nature more of that servitude of the compassionate side of what a firefighter is, the non-aggressive. I remember, and I'm not trying to steal this, but I remember, and it might have been, I think it was, it might have been at the same conference we met at. I remember sitting at a dinner with some of the local, firefighters. It was on the east side of Washington, eastern side of Washington, and they were saying how the local community, they could go into the community and go on a call and leave their vehicles unlocked, and the locals would not. Even there was gang type incidents going on, and they would respond to it, and they could leave their vehicles unlocked and the locals wouldn't mess with them. The police, the EMS, they couldn't do that. They had to lock everything
yeah.
when they were on an incident, but the fire didn't have to, because the community saw them as a non-judgmental. They were just there to help whoever needed it.
Yeah.
Do you think that plays into why that kind of a
Huge.
role would fall on us?
Huge. And I would further define it as you have never really been saddled with enforcement responsibility of behavior.
Right.
So it's easier for fire to be received with an initial impulse by the person served of that's help coming.
Right.
Whereas,
Non-aggressor. That's not
yeah,
an aggressor. Yeah.
right. And whereas the law enforcement domain with that uniform means that change is coming. And there are so many good people in law enforcement that work incredibly hard to offset the impact that their very presence non-verbally can have in a situation
Right.
before they even make contact. And um, I have a colleague who is a crisis outreach police officer in a not a small city here in Washington, and actually working with the leadership. He goes out and deliberately searches for problems before the 911 system is activated. So he's going into encampments not called. Who needs referrals for services?
Wow.
Who looks like there's going who do you know that may be going into crisis here that I can help? Trying to get ahead of it.
Right. Not as a responder into a situation that's already there, but proactively.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's going in
That's
there with
awesome.
level 3 armor. He's armed, he's got gloves on, and he's working with the leadership actually to say, "Hey, can I get a plate carrier in blue? Can I get a placard? Can I do some things with my uniform that put me more in a helping capacity, because I have hundreds of years of tradition that are influencing the lens through which people see me when I go to help. And I
Their
have to get through that."
perceptions are so strong. Symbolism alone. Yeah,
Yep.
that's incredible.
So what I do today, in short, brother, is raise awareness and competencies in responding to anger, aggression, and violence within the entire public safety apparatus, all the agencies, behavioral health, both institutional and community, all the agencies. And now what's really growing explosively is workplace violence prevention in private enterprise. So companies standing up departments that support and organize for their people trainings in mental health first aid, verbal de-escalation, self-regulation, wellness, things that empower workforces to a greater degree of competence and overall well-being in a rapidly changing landscape that's very scary to a lot of people. And I absolutely love what I do. It's like training people to be the fire service for behavioral crisis.
Well, and I like your that emphasis on self-control.
Oh,
Because I mean, and that's what we're talking about mostly anyhow, with our little segue here is learning about ourselves. that self-control side, because if I can control myself, if I learn the tools that I need to regulate my own behaviors, my own thought processes, and my own judgments, how can I better equip myself to then help Andy or the next person deal with those situations?
And
So
we've heard
that's
all the
awesome.
analogies, right? You know, when the oxygen mask drops from the airplane, you got
Hmm.
to put it on yourself first before you
Right.
help
Yeah.
somebody else. Um, Nobody ever suppressed anger with anger. In other words, calm down never seems to work, yet it's our
Right.
first
Right.
impulse to do it. We have to train to be the very change we want to see in another human being. There's no running on the fire ground. Self-control, be a professional, um, follow the command structure, leverage your training in a self-regulated. I mean, when you just think about rope rescue for a minute. There's a lot of math that
Yeah.
goes into doing that right. And there are a lot of moving parts where the moment you send someone over an edge, all of that means something. And if one thing
Right.
has not been enacted correctly, an anchor, an intermediate anchor, a high directional, a change direction, if one of those parts was not done correctly, that means that the attendant and the patient package are done. So you can't do that in a panic.
Right. No, no. Well, fire command is like that. It's almost, it's probably at some level harmful, but you develop this ability to suppress the adrenal release when the pager goes off.
Yep. Yep.
And that can have consequences later on if it's not managed right. But yeah,
Yeah, man.
learning those types of controls and triggers and how to respond, it's always going to be a trigger. But how, if I'm expecting that and I know what the response from my body is going to be, how can I manage it?
Yep.
Which
Yep.
brings me into my last part that I wanted to talk about. I think we're pushing our time here anyhow.
It's okay. We're at
It,
the end.
yeah, and this was kind of the connect the dots. This was the piece that brought where we met up to where we're at today, and that was you have this other little thing you do on the side called snakes in the garden.
Yeah.
And shameless promotion, go for it, because I got to tell everybody, it's almost like a prerequisite if you're going to watch these episodes with Andy and I kind of almost have to ask that you kindly go out and watch the Snake in the Garden podcast. I think we are up to 9 episodes now.
Yeah, my partner
I
Lev
believe.
has been busy and we haven't
Sure.
recorded an episode in a while, but um uh I've made the decision to record another episode soon. Whether or not Lev will be with me is questionable, but
Well, you let me
um
know. I can stand in.
yep.
You
Yeah,
just
I
have to
mean,
call me
we
Matt,
can
not
get more into some of the
Liv.
kind of interoceptive internal landscape um
Right. And
of
that was the part that really keyed me in on, wow, what's Andy doing with his world today? Because yeah, it drew me in, and I actually watched them all multiple times or listened to them all multiple times. I have notes on all of them, how they relate to me. But the overwhelming, I guess, plot to all of them is it's about fixing yourself. It's about how to look at yourself and identify things that you may be doing that are harmful to yourself, harmful to the people around you. And I don't mean that in a dramatic fashion, but just things that you can improve on. That introspection, it's like 101 level college. This is how we talk to ourselves. This is how we fix ourselves, and this is how we move forward with who we really are, not who we think we should be.
I want to thank you for bringing that up because it makes me want to share why we named it Snakes in the Garden.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
there are, and you just used the word symbolism. There's a lot of symbolism to the snake in the garden
Mhm.
in the traditional Christian context and in other religious domains of thought. There's also a great anecdote um, that was penned by the great Miyamoto Musashi in the Book of Five Rings. And for those who don't know, Miyamoto Musashi was a swordsman in Japan, um, who was indomitable, never beaten, dozens of duels.
At a
And
very young age.
yeah,
Beating people twice his age.
yep,
With,
took his craft very seriously, constantly training, and wrote one of the most profound philosophical books of strategy and thought of all time, still widely read. There's an anecdote in that book where Miyamoto is sitting zazen meditation with a friend of his. He didn't have too many, but he had one who was also a swordsman. And a snake came into the area where they were sitting and slithered over his friend. And his friend was completely at peace and motionless, almost as if the snake didn't even know they were there. And then the snake gets to Miyamoto, looks at Miyamoto. Miyamoto looks at the snake. The snake freaks out and takes off. And he says to his buddy as they're sitting there, hey, did you see that? Yeah, I saw that. How come he goes over you like you're not even there and he comes to me and takes off? I don't want that effect on living creatures. I want what you have, because if I'm like that, I'll never be in relationship with people. And his friend said, you're right. So it was following that anecdote, that experience shortly thereafter, that Miyamoto began to dedicate all these thoughts to paper and describe the manner in which one can navigate and mediate the world. This is someone who was as formidable as he was, to recognize that there's a cost of all of that, and how can one change that and offset it. And he had his way of languaging through that. And today, arguably, the principles that we have identified in social learning psychology or polyvagal theory, and some of the latest research that we're doing in the dopamine system and how that mediates interpersonal relationships, is absolutely fascinating and completely aligned with many of his observations and findings from when he wrote that book. There are snakes in our garden, and we have to figure out how to live with them, because you can't eradicate them. And arguably, a garden needs snakes to mediate the other forces in the garden. So how do you be at peace with the snakes in your garden is really the mission of that podcast.
Yeah. So if you haven't, go check it out. It's worth your time.
Matt, thank you, my brother. I look forward to our next episode.
Yes, very good. And thank all three of you for watching.
Well stated. Take care, everyone.